Well, it must be admitted that Russia has once again brought the negotiations to a dead end, and more experts are convinced that the war definitely won't end in 2026. On the eve of the third round of negotiations in Geneva between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations, the Kremlin issued a new ultimatum. In Moscow, they called for establishing external control over Ukraine, removing Zelensky from leading the country, and after that, imposing Russian terms of surrender on Kyiv. To achieve these goals, the Kremlin changed the composition of the negotiating team by introducing the pseudo-historian Medinsky, and this is indeed a very important marker. At the same time, it became known that the main topics of the negotiations in Geneva on February 17th and 18th will be an energy truce and the issue of territory. And at the same time, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Donald Trump is not going to withdraw from the negotiations and intends to see them through to their logical conclusion. That is why Marco Rubio does not understand why the whole world is not admiring Donald Trump's work on Ukraine and not giving him a standing ovation. At the same time, military expert Ben Hodges stated directly that in his opinion, the war in Ukraine will definitely not end this year. And the reason is very simple. Donald Trump refuses to actually put real pressure on the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together and start this episode. I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So now let's go through everything step by step. On February 17th and 18th, another round of negotiations will take place in Geneva. Russia has stated that the main topic of this round of negotiations will be the issue of territories. For its part, Ukraine plans to raise the issue of an energy truce, said the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov. The Ukrainian delegation remains the same and it combines military, political, and security expertise. But Russia has demonstratively downgraded the status of its delegation. It will be headed by the aide to the Kremlin dictator, Vladimir Medinsky, who already participated in negotiations last year in Istanbul and became known as a pseudo-historian and ideologist of Vladimir Putin. At that time, the Russian side flatly refused a ceasefire and insisted on recognizing the occupied territories as Russian, as well as on limiting the size of the armed forces of Ukraine. And now there are already rumors that Vladimir Putin is demanding that the Ukrainian armed forces withdraw from Donbass and that the United States legally recognize this as now Russian territory. And Medinsky, more than anyone else, is ready to promote exactly this narrative. But I also noticed that after 2 rounds of negotiations in Abu Dhabi, the Russian delegation was headed by the Russian intelligence officer Kostyukov. Moscow, noticing that the discussions along military lines are constructive, is now trying to shift the focus of negotiations from security issues to political, social, religious, cultural, linguistic, and so on and so forth. Like, listen, everything regarding security has long been settled, but supposedly Ukraine is not ready for other steps. For example, about the Russian language, about the church, about the Russian-speaking population, and so on and so forth. That's basically it. This is an attempt to blur the very subject of the negotiations, and suddenly at the last moment, Russia decided to introduce yet another new topic into the talks, or rather, a new old one. Before the negotiations in Geneva, Russia once again began to push Vladimir Putin's proposal to introduce external governance in Ukraine under the auspices of the United Nations, which was made in March 2025. Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation Mikhail Galuzin stated that Russia is ready to discuss this issue with other countries after the end of the war and beyond. Here is his quote. Such precedents have taken place within the framework of the peacekeeping activities of the United Nations. Overall, Russia is ready to discuss with the United States, European, and other countries the possibility of introducing temporary external administration in Kyiv. Such a step will make it possible to hold democratic elections in Ukraine and bring a capable government to power, with which it would be possible to sign a full-fledged peace treaty and legitimate documents on future interstate cooperation. Well, what do you think? If this Galuzin is talking about cooperation between Ukraine and Russia, then who should be created? The Kremlin proposes itself, that is Moscow, as the main force in this future external governance of Ukraine, of course. The idea is to replace the concept of occupation with a nice definition of external governance for the duration of the elections. At the same time, the Kremlin makes it clear that it is not ready to sign a peace agreement with the current authorities in Kyiv. And here I would like to remind you that back on March 28 of last year, dictator Putin said that introducing international temporary administration in Ukraine could help end the war. Because right now, Russia doesn't understand who it should make an agreement with. At that time, Putin once again stated that President Zelensky's stay at the head of Ukraine was illegal, noting that, quote, if he is illegitimate, then everyone else in Ukraine is also illegitimate. But this balding misunderstanding, Putin forgets to mention that he himself is illegitimate. Because he himself, treated the Russian constitution like a prostitute and rewrote that Russian constitution himself. And he forgot that he has been in power for more than 25 years already. What kind of legitimacy can this creature talk about? But this is also a huge signal to Donald Trump. Back then, in the spring of last year, the United States clearly rejected Putin's initiative for external control over Ukraine. State Department spokesperson Temi Bryce emphasized that United States President Donald Trump did not approve of this idea, since Ukraine is a democracy and its governance is determined solely by its constitution and its people. And now, almost a year later, the Kremlin is saying, listen, we don't care at all about what some Donald Trump did or didn't approve, didn't accept. Listen, we're putting this idea up for discussion again, basically. Trump said no at the time and wouldn't discuss it, but Russia insists on reopening the discussion. I don't know how Donald Trump feels after something like that, but at the very least, it's another slap in the face. It seems to me that from Moscow's side, his face has already been spat on as much as possible. But on the other hand, don't forget that Donald Trump supports the idea of holding presidential elections in Ukraine. Despite the ongoing fighting, this issue began to be discussed again in 2026 at the trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi on the United States peace plan. Let me remind you, the vote was supposed to take place back in the spring of 2024, but it was postponed due to martial law. At the beginning of December 2025, Zelensky announced his readiness to hold elections in just 2-3 months. But Trump is in no hurry to do this and simply insists that Putin supposedly wants peace. Nevertheless, on Saturday, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Washington will not back down. He will fulfill his commitments to achieve an end to the war in Ukraine, and Trump is not going to walk away from the negotiations, no matter how much the bold dictator Putin might want that. Today, though, Marco Rubio, made a mistake. He said he was surprised by the reaction of the international community to President Donald Trump's peace initiatives regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. He said that the United States is the only country on earth. This was a quote that managed to bring both sides to the negotiating table, but for some reason no one is applauding this, and further, that's a quote from Marco Rubio. Neither the United Nations nor any other country in Europe could have done this. Instead of supporting Washington's efforts, part of the international community criticizes Trump for trying to help end the war. This is one of the few wars I've ever seen where some people in the international community condemn you for trying to help end the war. But there is less and less belief that these negotiations will lead to peace anytime soon. Former United States Army commander in Europe, Ben Hodges, stated directly that Russia's war against Ukraine is unlikely to end in 2026. The Russians are not interested in this. The Kremlin may only agree to a truce after external pressure. But I don't see the United States government putting that kind of pressure on them. Unfortunately, I'll have to leave it at that. Share your thoughts and conclusions in the comments below. If you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially with your donation or paid subscription. All links and payment details are in the video description. Multiple platforms are available, so pick whichever is convenient. I would be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.